KJ, what's going on, my man? How you doing today? You doing okay?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing okay. I brought you back on, and I appreciate you coming back on. I'm not going to hold you long. I was fascinated and proud of China for this. So Donald Trump apparently has 145% tariffs on China. China comes back, says we're not going to take it, and put 125% tariffs on the U.S. Xi Jinping came out and made a statement. At least I had it up. Here we are. Xi Jinping said for over 70 years, China development has relied on self reliance and hard work, never on handouts from others, and it is not afraid of any unjust suppression. Regardless of how the external environment changes, China will remain confident, stay focused, and concentrate on managing its own affairs. Basically, we're not backing down. I love this. What's going on with this? Give me a take.
Let me read you what the State Council Tariff Commission has said. They said the US's imposition of high tariffs on China seriously violates international economic and trade rules. It does. Basic economic laws. It does. I'll explain that in a moment. And common sense. And is a completely unilateral bullying and coercion. And they say essentially, we're not going to put up with it. We are elevating our tariffs to 125%. And then they say, given at that current tariff level, there is no market acceptance for U.S. goods exported to China. And then if the US continues to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, China will ignore it. In other words, they're saying you can't do anything to us. Now, what the US is doing, I don't know if it realizes this because this entire administration seems to be run by economic flat earthers. They have a flat earth theory of economics. And what I mean by that is that they seem to think, as the neo mercantilists or the mercantilists think, that national wealth is a function of the balance of payments. It's not. Your national wealth is not a function of the balance of your current account. It is, we measure national wealth by GDP. So to give you the analogy, let's say that I go and buy bread from my baker. I mean, that's a deficit. That's a current account deficit with the baker or the grocer because they're not buying anything back from me. And the same thing, if when I work for my employer, the employer pays me a salary, that's a deficit or a liability for them. And so if you believe that you have to run a current account balance with everybody you interact with, that's a formula for no economic activity. I mean, it's a formula for what is called autarky, but it's not going to work in this modern economic system that we inhabit. So it is complete madness. As I said, it's economic flat earth thinking. But the other thing which is foolish about this is that China is not going to be hurt very much by this. Of course, it will have some impact, but it's going to hurt the United States much, much more than China. Of course, inflation and then stagflation and then possibly recession, global recession. But let's do a little calculation here. If the U.S. imports something that costs $100 from China, $12 of that actually goes to China, and $88 goes to other sources, mostly the United States. And so the cost of that is about 7 times more for the United States than it is for China. If you impose a tariff, the cost and that good is not imported, then the cost or the loss to the United States is 7 times more for the United States than it is for China. In other words, it's like, let's say you're in a fight with somebody and you're trying to bully them, and you've decided that you're going to hit them with the softest part of your body on their hardest part. It's like, I'm going to attack you with my nose, on your knee. Okay, who's going to hurt, right? This is what the U.S. is doing right now. China's trade with the United States is worth about 3% of GDP. It's about 600 billion, of which 462 billion last year was exports, or rather U.S. imports from China, and then the trade deficit was about 263 billion. Those amounts, people don't realize it, are trivial to China. China can easily absorb those costs. I mean, it will have to do some QE and some macroeconomic adjustments, etc. But it can absorb those costs. Can the U.S. absorb those costs? No. That's why you're seeing not only catastrophic losses in the stock market, but you're also seeing huge losses in the bond market as well. In the meantime, China's Hang Seng Index and the Shanghai Composite, they're actually trending upwards. The Chinese stock market is okay. It's going up. And the US stock market is cascading downwards. So, I mean, this is utter stupidity, utter foolishness. It's run by flat earthers like Peter Navarro, who seems to think that, let me give you this. Peter Navarro said, Trump knows what he's doing. And the goal is to reindustrialize. And, this is the biggest trade deal in history, created by the smartest trade team in history. It's playing out exactly the way we wanted.
That is
Everything will get better. A beautiful thing is happening, and it will happen faster with Trump. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, those words, that level of insanity, of out of touch stupidity, should frighten everybody. And I assure you, everybody is frightened. Certainly, the donor class to Trump, his own, financialized plutocrat class, is tearing their head out right now. And this is why he lowered the tariffs on other countries. But his continued fight with China is just absolute stupidity.
Well, he lowered the tariffs with other countries because of the bond market. They said it explicitly because of the bond market. Apparently, and as I was telling the audience, usually when there's like economic stress, the bond market is where people go to be safe. The thought being, okay, well, the US government is going to remain. So if we buy US treasuries, we know we're going to get the US treasuries back. So this is the place of safety. And it wasn't working that way. The inverse was taking place, where people were selling bonds, or countries were selling bonds. And when they went to auction more, nobody bought them. Nobody would buy them, which gave this impression like, oh my God, the integrity of the state is being on some level challenged, or at the very least questioned. And they started to freak out. Hence, Trump came back down and was like, okay, okay, we will cut this to 10%, but we're going to keep him on China. China also has US treasuries, correct?
Correct, yes.
They have a ton of them.
Probably somewhere in the range of 700 billion last time I count. It's not quite clear. So they could sell those off, but there is a massive sell off of T bills, and we don't think it's China. We think it's other countries. All countries are divesting themselves from the United States. So this capricious activity is not only, torn a hole in confidence, but it's demonstrated. Here's the thing: it's not simply that it's capricious. It's not simply that it's you know constantly shifting and changing, but it looks crazy and it looks stupid. And when you look crazy and stupid, you lose the confidence of everybody. You just can't do business with that.
Why don't they sell off those treasuries to make a point?
It's a long story, but I they have been. The short answer to that is yes, they have been. They used to have about 1.2 trillion, and they've gotten rid of about half of it or close to half of it, and they will. They'll continue to get rid of them, and they will diversify those that capital into other sources. But they're trying to do it gently and slowly. And who knows, they could start to accelerate, but at this current point they don't need to do anything. If they sold those off, they would also take a hit, so they're trying to minimize that loss. But they would have to sell them. They wouldn't get face value for them, so they're trying to minimize that loss. They're trying to offload them onto other countries who want to buy them. But I think over the long term, it is going to seriously damage, I mean, it already has the confidence in the United States as a kind of a safe harbor. We know now that there is no such thing as a safe harbor. There is a complete lack of trust and a complete lack of confidence in the United States, and that will have tremendous impact on U.S. markets.
I was looking for this clip that I played earlier because I wanted to get your take on the clip, and for the life of me, I can no longer find the clip. Um, Let me ask you something else. So, the position of China is effectively okay, we're not going to respond if you guys do anything else. But they have been trying to work with other countries. They went to Australia. Australia didn't want to be bothered, but they're also going to the European Union. And so there was a report out that the European Union is meeting with China in July. The European leaders apparently had their own retaliation package, but they held the retaliation package. Basically, they had to stay their hand for a time being. But EU leaders plan a trip to Beijing in July for the summit with Xi Jinping. My thought is, why don't these countries work together on this? I mean, for all intents and purposes, if the bully gets you in the corner in the gym class, okay, that's you 101. If 10 of you are together, okay, that's different. It seems to me the United, from my point of view, this is the tipping point. I find this to be every bit as important as Ukraine and Russia, where the tipping point was the United States was trying to articulate um, turn kinetic military power and assert that military power through a proxy, and they lost, or at the very least, are in the process of losing. And in this case, they're trying to kinetic or turn potential energy in regards to economic sense, kinetic, in using this kind of the might of the financial system of the US to attack other countries. Whereas China is effectively saying, no, you don't have that power. You can't do that to us. That doesn't work with us, which on some level is a change. If this was the 2000s, okay, this might work. We're in 2025. And at the very least, China is saying no. And it seems like they're trying to work with other countries in order to make that no that much more forceful. Do you think they're going to be able to do it? I saw Europe and China were in talks about the car market being one of the changes that were effectively taking place. What's going on with us?
Too early to tell, Jamal, but I think that China's overtures will probably have some measure of effect. I think China is, reaching out. Clearly, it's reaching out to ASEAN. It's reaching out to its BRICS partners. Certainly, it already has good relations with Russia, and now it's reaching out to the EU and see if they can build a coalition to resist Trump's tariffs. Now, China is doing that. It's also developing its internal market, what's called the dual circulation. It's developing its internal market, and then it'll do a whole bunch of QE type, stimulation measures inside its own economy. It's not a lot of money that China has to overcome. Like I said, the 3%, it's 3% of GDP, China's trade with the United States. That's the size of a large Chinese city. The entirety of the United States is equivalent to about the GDP growth of a Chinese city. So
Wow.
it's not a make or break deal with it. It's slightly painful. There'll be some penny pinching, some waist tightening, but they have tools to deal with it, both reaching outwards, stimulating, the economy, consumption internally, as well as increasing pulling on various fiscal levers. So they will weather it. And in fact, if you look at the kind of elite Washington magazines like Foreign Affairs, uh, they have just come out with an article. They said trade wars are easy to lose. Beijing has escalation dominance. Beijing has escalation dominance over the US. They're exactly right. And they point out, one of the reasons is because the US, what it gets from China are goods, and what China gets from the US is money. Now, money is fungible. That is, you can replace money with money. So you can replace it through a variety of different ways. But what the US gets from China are finished goods, or intermediary goods. Those are not easy to replace. That supply chain is not easy to replace, and in certain cases there are things that are almost irreplaceable. I'm talking about the 17 lanthanides, rare earth metals, etc., which China has put restrictions on about 7 of them. That could also be tightened further. But going back to your original question, why don't these countries all work together, coordinate together against Trump? Well, the process is starting, but remember, in the case of the EU, it's like, why don't the people who are being bullied, gang up against the bully? And the reason for that is that the EU, they're mostly former colonial states, they were the bully's sidekick, right?
Mhm.
Bully psychic. They didn't expect the bully to turn on them so rapidly. But I mean, that's the logic of the world that they inhabit, right? What is there? No honor among thieves, right?
Yeah.
And so I think they're trying to make that adjustment. Von der Leyen is, trying to calibrate, after all the ideology of American exceptionalism, Western exceptionalism, she's now trying to swallow, the bitter pill that the US has actually been the threat all along. The call has been coming from inside the house. So they're trying to, maneuver and recalibrate their entire cosmology and theology and worldview. So I think that's why it's taking time. But if they're rational, they will understand that it's in their interest to ally with China and the rest of the world to deal with this, rather than go down on bended knee. Because if you go down on bended knee, nothing good is going to happen to you.
Who said nothing happen nothing good happens on your knees.
Mm.
Here's a clip I want to get your take on. Um, I am, as I was telling my audience, the level of incompetence is breathtaking in this clip. It's the fact that he has a show and he is looking into the camera and saying this to other human beings is mind blowing. This is something on Fox News. I don't know who this guy is. Was it Jesse Waters? I don't know his name. Waters. Waters. Okay, I don't know his name. Doesn't matter. He's not
Rally
saying anything
with.
important. Listen to what he says. This is breathtaking.
Now, what is you're seeing right now is Trump is getting the entire world to rally with us against the Chinese. If he can cut deals so they lower their trade barriers against us, invest in the United States, bring their factories here, and raise their trade barriers.
Real quick, I got to interrupt that real quick. I'll play it from the beginning. Trump, by tariffing the world, is getting the world to come together against the Chinese. I missed that the first time I played that clip. He's tariffing the world. The entire world is pissed off. The world economies are going, pot. And he's like, Trump is rallying the world against the Chinese. Okay, tell us more.
Now, what is you're seeing right now is Trump is getting the entire world to rally with us against the Chinese. If he can cut deals so they lower their trade barriers against us, invest in the United States, bring their factories here, and raise their trade barriers against China, what that does to China, it collapses their economy, mass unemployment, and then possibly the regime gets toppled. So if they don't want their regime getting toppled, they have to cut a deal with us. So
KJ, Xi Jinping is almost on his way out because Donald Trump put tariffs on China. That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yes, I didn't know that either. This is the level in which they are completely detached from reality. Not only are they not rallying other countries against China, they are actually rallying Trump is rallying his own backers against him. The plutocrat class that was funding him, they are pissed off at him. They are rallying against him. I think there was an article, was it the Wall Street Journal? They said, Trump has pissed off, the investor class. That they're furious with him. So he's not rallying anybody. Everybody's, if they're not in, kind of trembling in shock, they're pissed off as hell. And certainly, it is not doing anything against China. China is coming out looking like, the person who stood up to the bully. But this piece about destroying China and regime changing China is actually very, very true. This has been, a 4 decade or actually 7 decade long process that the United States has had as a goal against China. And when the United States opened up access to the WTO and brought China into the, quote unquote, the, global economy, the original goal, and you can read it in policy papers, the original goal was that they would be able to do a Soviet Union on China, that they would bring it down through market access, that they would essentially open up the country, and then the country would have no other choice but to liberalize and either become a capitalist vassal, which it isn't and won't be, or it would collapse of its own inner contradictions. This is Hillary Clinton. She said, China is a Potemkin state. It's just waiting to collapse. All we have to do is continually, keep interacting with us. They'll see how great we are. And then eventually they will either come over to us or will simply destroy their country. So US engagement with China was a regime change operation. It always has been a soft regime change operation, but that was the intention of it. So this notion that, Peter Navarro and other people say, or J.D. Vance say, they used us, they were taking advantage of us, they were trying to steal their way to the top, etc. Nonsense, absolute nonsense. The US made out like bandits, or rather the US plutocrat class made out like bandits. And in the meantime, the plan was to see if they could destroy China, undermine it, or at the very least, force it to change its system, sell off all of its state-owned enterprise, 70% of its economy, to US investors who would buy it at fire sale prices. And that is not working. But that regime change agenda has always been the case. And this thing about rallying against the Chinese, remember, before Trump came in, there was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was a plan to rally all the countries of the Pacific Basin against China. Trump, got rid of it, and he just started, a full-on frontal assault with tariffs. But even his tariffs were a two-phase project. The first phase was, simply buying more U.S. goods. The second phase was going to demand that China change its economic system, that it get rid of its state-owned enterprises, which it would never do. So there's a fundamental mindset of the U.S. that thinks that it has a goal to regime change China, change its system, or else completely subjugate it. And if it doesn't, then all bets are off, and we do anything and everything necessary to bring it down. And the problem is, they can't do it. The only option really is kinetic war. I've said, the wall defibrillator for the U.S. economy is war. So are they going to go to war? Will they go? And if they go to war, that war will be nuclear. There's no way they can win a conventional war against China. So the question is, are they planning to use tactical nukes? If you look at the policy papers, it looks like that. But on a purely economic dimension, there's no way that they can destroy or regime change China in this fashion. And it is, as you point out, it's going to be about as effective as the U.S. Measures against Russia, which were not simply kinetic war. They were also sanctions, right? Those sanctions didn't work against Russia. They showed how impotent the U.S. was to levy sanctions and to bring Russia to its knees. Russia is doing much, much better. And so I think that once again, these tariffs will show the impotence of the bully against the rest of the world, and certainly against the powerful and developing Chinese who are standing up for the rest of the world.
I would love to hear your take on the interview I had with Brian Beletic.
Mm,
Oh, I would love to hear your take on that interview. Because what Brian talks about is the U.S., oh, geez, trying to get choke points like Panama Canal,
yes.
Greenland, to effectively use a global military
Hmm.
in regards to shipping power, naval power,
Yes.
because it can't necessarily take China head on, but if
Hmm.
it can take shipping lanes,
Hmm.
that's something that it may be able to do where it has an advantage that China doesn't necessarily have
Hmm.
currently. And I guess
Hmm.
my thing was, well, China's going to build boats, ships. It's going to fill those boats and ships with the 25 million man military that it got. And it is going to be an arms race in regards to getting those boats and ships out. But his point was, okay, that's in the future. Currently, that may be the plan now. And
Hmm.
that part of what Donald Trump is doing is decoupling the US economy from the Chinese economy, knowing it's going to hurt, knowing people are going to lose their jobs, knowing people are going to be hungry and everything else, and that various markets are not going to be filled, and not care with the notion of, okay, this is what we're going to do in order to deal with and compete with China. Um, Give me your thoughts on that. I mean, because his point is, look, China is a rising power. And
Hmm.
yeah, they may be an economically dominant power. And yeah, they have an industry that is just ungodly. But right now, the US has a capability of projecting power globally.
Hmm.
And those choke points where trade is taking place, the plan seems to be to take those choke points. So all of a sudden, we need to defend Panama Canal.
Hmm.
We need to defend Greenland.
Hmm.
And effectively, what that means is the U.S. wants to take those things in order to effectively control those lanes,
Hmm.
even in the South China Sea, where they're
Yeah.
like freedom of navigation. And it's
Hmm.
like, okay, freedom from who? Nobody is threatening Greenland. Nobody is threatening
Hmm.
Panama. Nobody is threatening the South China Sea except
Hmm.
for you. What's your thoughts on that?
So, Brian is absolutely correct. It is all about choke points. And you have to understand that the colonial imperial powers like Portugal, Spain, the Dutch,
Britain?
UK, Britain, etc.,
Yeah.
they were all maritime powers. They're all powerful navies. That's why the British said, rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves, right? And there's an entire doctrine behind this. This is the theories of Mahan, who essentially says, you know, uh, sea power dominates land power. Okay. In the 20th century, there was another geographer, Alfred Mackinder, who said, no, actually, the world is shifting. Land power can actually resist sea power. And with the development of overland routes through rail, land power can actually dominate sea power. And this is what China has been doing with the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road, of course, is ports, but a lot of it is overland rail lines, essentially connecting the entire Eurasian continent, China, Russia, and Europe through overland rail. And so that was one response. It's very, very clear right from the get go that the US was trying to choke off China, strangle it. These plans go back to 2011, if not earlier, with the plan of air sea battle. This is the war doctrine against China, which is essentially to create to use the bottleneck of the South China Sea, one of the key and most important choke points in this theory of choke points. They would create a shooting war, and that would strangle out China's economy, making it lose 25 to 35% of its GDP, which would they in their estimation would destroy China's viability as a society. So what China did was it started building the Belt and Road outside and to avoid the South China Sea. Well, what's the first exit from that into the ocean? That would be in Pakistan and Myanmar. and both of those countries have been completely destabilized. And I think,
Yeah.
again, Brian would agree with me that destabilization, the destabilization of CPEC in Pakistan with Baloch separatist movement is significantly influenced by U.S. interests. The NED, USAID, all of that. They were crawling in there. Same thing with Myanmar, CMEC, the Jakfu port. That is another exit from that, choke point. That again, Myanmar was also destabilized, and the USAID was crawling all over Rakhine State, trying to get people and CSOs to fight against these overland pipelines and rail routes, etc. And now it has moved out to Bangladesh into the Indian Ocean. Again, constant coups and disruption. So you can see what's going here. It's like a game of Go. You're trying to move up the ladder, and the ladder just keeps going longer and longer, up the board. But the choke points are now global. So they're thinking we have to cut off Chinese trade everywhere and anywhere that we can. And the question is, A, is it possible? B, is it possible to decouple from China? And I think at least in the short to middle to even long term, I don't think it's possible, because the US, excuse me, US corporations are in the phase of financialization. Corporations, they become large, they overtake the market, specific market sectors, and then they financialize. Why do they financialize? Because financialization is easy profits. You don't have to build or take the risk of building anything and selling stuff. You just gouge money through rentier profits. You say, we have the market, you have to pay us. We're just, a toll booth.
Collecting rent.
We're
Yeah.
just collecting rent. This is why, for example, when the American working class can no longer buy GM cars, what does GM do? It becomes a financial company, right? GM Capital. And instead of selling cars, it's selling car loans, right? So this is the constant process of financialization that you see in advanced capitalist economies. You immiserate the working class, you screw them 50 ways to Tuesday, and then when they don't have money, you financialize everything so that they have to pay you, whether they have it or not. That's why you're paying exorbitant amounts of rent. That's why you're paying through the nose for your college education. That's why even when you want to buy a burrito, you can log on to your app and it will, give you the option to pay for your burrito in 5 easy installments, right? I mean, this is the financialization of everything. And in the meantime, these monopoly corporations know that they don't have to give you anything. They just simply have control. They have you buy the gonads, and they also have the government buy the gonads. They can do whatever they want to. And in the meantime, you're just simply being screwed over and immiserated, and you just have to deal with it. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. So this entire choke point theory is very, very important. And it is really, the kind of big picture geostrategic policy that's going on. Just a quick word about freedom of navigation. The freedom of navigation. The other, corresponding concept is the EEZ. This is the economic zone, the exclusive economic zone. And you have to understand. Let me ask you a question, Jamal. Which country has the largest EEZ on the planet?
I don't know. Oh, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Take a guess.
I would say China. I mean, it's massive.
No,
The country
no,
is massive.
no. China has a minuscule EEZ. The EEZ of China is smaller than New Zealand, which has a population of a few million people.
Maybe the U.S.
The
Well,
U.S.
let me
Yeah.
ask you this: what is the exclusion economic zone? Explain what that is first.
So it means that you own a piece of territory, and you have a 200-mile exclusive zone, inside which you can exploit the resources. inside
Oh,
that EEZ?
oh, maybe Russia.
No, no, not even
I think Russia.
close.
I
So,
don't know.
so the countries with the largest EEZ, the country with the largest EEZ is France.
Really?
I'm not kidding you. Yeah, it's something like 11 million kilometers. And the country with the second largest EEZ is the United States. Okay. Now, why?
France has the largest. It's a tiny country. France is like a, it's like a state for us.
It's a small country, and it's a small strip of the Mediterranean, and it's a small strip of the Adriatic. That's all it has. But what it has is it has overseas colonies, what they call the dom-tom, and it still owns them. Kanaki, it still has control over Kanaki. It still has control over large parts of the global South. And the same thing for the United States. These countries, I mean, 11 million square kilometers, that's like multiples of anything China has. A reason why they have such huge EEZs is because this concept of EEZ is a way of continuing colonial domination over the planet. That is, as the world was decolonizing, the European Western colonial powers were losing landmass. And in order to compensate for that, they created this regime of EEZs where they said, okay, we lose the land, but we still get to control the oceans. We still have access to all the ocean resources, and then we also project power over these oceans. So the US has a strip of islands all the way across the Pacific. These are tiny tide markers rocks, but the US claims vast EEZs around them. Same thing for France, same thing for the colonial powers. And so if you really think about that, this notion of an EEZ is the kind of substitution of control of land for control of water, power projection over the water, including power projection over the choke points. And then the other thing is, this notion of freedom of navigation, simply gunboat diplomacy. It's gunboat diplomacy with a new name. But the traditional legal concept is Mare Nostrum. Mare Nostrum means it's our sea. And during the colonial period, the Dutch came up with this concept of mare liberum, or freedom of the seas, meaning that we get to move anywhere we want to and project power anywhere we want to, and we get to steal stuff anytime anything is on the seas. This is literally this notion of mare liberum
Powerfully.
was started in a court case where the Dutch had grabbed a Portuguese carrack, and they had essentially it's piracy. They had taken it over, stolen its good, and they were taken to court. And they said, "Look, it was on the high seas. The high seas belong to everybody. God has designated the high seas for everybody. That's why the wind blows in all directions, and therefore it was on the high seas, and we took it, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it." This is where this concept of freedom of navigation comes from. It's the Hugo de Grotius. So anyway, all of these things are grounded in this continuous colonial imperial power grab. And the choke points are simply an extension of this, that the Western imperial powers should continue to control the planet, and in particular by controlling specific choke points, the arteries and the veins of global trade, and in this specific situation, to choke China out and to make it tap out and to strangle it to death.
KJ, you are fantastic. I swear to God, you are. I am fortunate to even have you as a guest. I deeply appreciate you coming on the show. One last thing. I got to get one last thing in. Donald Trump. And I hate to follow what you just explained up with this,
Spending money
but
on
I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. This is somebody who's not that bright. Listen to what he says, and I want to get your take on it.
about all of the people that say, well, deficits, if we have a deficit with the country, or if the country has a big surplus with us, like China has a massive surplus, that they take and they spend on their military. Well, we don't want that. I don't want them to take 500, 600 billion dollars a year and spend it on their military. I don't want them spending money on their military. And I shouldn't have to spend money. We shouldn't have to spend it either.
Okay. Well,
I
I mean,
cannot
this.
believe this Neanderthal is president.
Oh,
It's like just knuckle dragging.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to what I said, this flat earth theory that, national wealth is a balance of payments. That's not how it works. National wealth is GDP. GDP is a flawed, index, but it still gives a much, much better understanding of what national wealth is than simply a balance of payments. That's not how it works. That's how it works in a neo-mercantile era, where you think that autarky or bullion, the accumulation of bullion and precious metals is actually a possibility. It's no longer possible in this modern world with connected supply chains. But it's like, as I said, it's like, you buy bread from the baker, he doesn't buy anything back from you, and therefore you're in a current deficit, and therefore you should stop buying bread from the baker. How stupid is that, And as this whole notion of deindustrialization, blah, 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 they stole our jobs. The point at which you should have imposed tariffs was when those companies went abroad.
Yes.
When those companies started going abroad, that's when you should have imposed tariffs when they tried to re-import those things. And then you could have taken those tariffs and used that money to alleviate the genuine, real suffering of workers who had entire industries gutted. That piece is true, but that should have been done 4 decades ago. And so
No.
that, of course, is out of the ban. You're not out of the barn. You're not going to catch up with that now. But this notion that China is spending 500 billion, it doesn't spend 500 billion on its military. China, since 1985, China has continually reduced the manpower of its military by about 2 million. Okay, it's reduced its troops by about 2 million. I think most recently it cut the size of its troops by 300,000. That's in the 2017. So it is not an expanding military, although its budget is increasing, and the budget is increasing commensurate to its increase in to the growth of its economy. And so people are bloviating, China is built the greatest military, build up in the history of mankind. No, not even close. Not even close. As I said, China's military is about 1/4 of the United States. China's military budget is about 1/4 of the United States. And to the extent that it has a military, this is mostly a defensive military because it knows the US is out to get it, because it's encircling it with bases and weapons and alliances and standoff weapons. And China spends 4 times on education what it spends on its military, right? And the US spends 4 times on its military what it spends on education. Now it's going to be 5 or 6 times with the Trump additions. But essentially, to kind of call out this quote unquote Chinese military threat and to say that, first that is absurd because China does not pose a threat to the United States. And then to think that, China is funding this through, kind of deficits and unfair trade, that's wrong. But what we do know is that the US is paying for its military, its 800 bases around the world. A large part of that is coming from its exorbitant privilege as a global reserve currency, as the dollar, its capacity to print the dollar. So it's completely misguided, more flat earth thinking. And this is the problem. If you are that misguided, irrational, then you can't move forward. Because what you're saying doesn't make any sense. With a flat Earth theory, you are not going to be able to do global trade. And this is a flat Earth theory of economics.
KJ, you are fantastic. I swear to God, the audience loves you. I love you coming onto the show. I thank you so much. KJ No, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, you are also on a show. Please tell the audience where they can find you.
It is called the China Report on YouTube on the Breakthrough News Network. And this coming Tuesday, we will be having Ben Norton, and he and I will be unpacking this down to its most critical detail.
Fantastic. Ben Norton is another really good one. Shout out to both of you on this one. Thank you for this, KJ. I really do. Great breakdown.
Thank you.
You have a good one. Be safe. All right. I feel smarter listening to KJ. That is